I have attended the Salon Dorado's Charity Tuesdays for 44 years, and in all that time, I have never once seen a lottery clerk take the stage. I mention that so you understand how completely the evening had arranged itself against what happened next. The Salon Dorado holds 380 seats when every velvet cushion is occupied, which on Charity Tuesdays it never quite is. There are gaps in the back rows, and the lighting above the balcony is the color of old paper, and the plasterwork gilding along the upper frieze has shed itself in patches since the renovation ran out of money in 1989. None of that matters when the hall is working. When the hall is working, you forget the gaps and the peeling gilt and you remember only the acoustics, a peculiarity of the curved ceiling that collects sound the way a cupped hand collects water and holds it there, warm, slightly longer than physics ought to allow. The charity evening in question was a Tuesday in late autumn. The program had been the usual pleasant arrangement, a string quartet to open, a mezzo-soprano who had driven down from the capital, and the headliner, Maestro Aldrich Vane, who had been celebrated in 3 countries and was gracious enough to remember it in all of them. He was somewhere in his late 60s, silver-haired, with the particular posture of a man who has been applauded standing for so long that he has simply forgotten how to slouch. He played the first half magnificently, a Schubert sonata that moved through the room like weather, and a short foray nocturne that ended on a chord so quiet it felt like the hall was holding its breath to hear it. I had heard Vane a dozen times over the years. He was the real thing, and he knew it, and on most evenings that combination worked in everyone's favor. The interval came. I had my customary glass of the terrible house wine, standing near the left side of the hall where a short flight of stairs leads up to the stage apron. The Börsendorfer stood uncovered and unattended. Vane's technician had gone to find coffee, with its lid raised and its keys catching the amber stage light. It is an instrument of serious age and serious quality, and looking at it from below you get a sense of the thing's mass, the physical weight of it, the way it occupies space the way a large sleeping animal does. I noticed the young man because he was noticeably out of place. He was perhaps 24 slight, with the watchful economy of movement that belongs to people who are accustomed to being unremarkable. He wore a jacket that had been pressed but not recently, and his hands, I noticed the hands because I have always noticed hands, were the ink-stained, paper-worn hands of a clerk, someone who spent his days processing things, handing things across a counter. He had drifted up the stage stairs during the interval without apparent intention, the way people approach things they love when they believe no one is looking, and he stood beside the Börsendorfer with his right hand just not quite touching the lid. He had not touched it. He was not touching it. He was simply close to it, the way you stand close to a fire without reaching out, just taking the warmth from the air. That was when Maestro Vane appeared from the wing. I do not know whether Vane was in poor humor or simply accustomed to having every room arrange itself to his preferences. What I know is that he saw the young man beside his piano and that his face moved through something surprise, then assessment, then a performance decision. He was not cruel in any simple way. He was the kind of man who frames his cruelties as demonstrations. He crossed the stage with his hands folded behind his back, and he said, loudly enough to be heard by the dozen or so people milling near the apron, "Is there something you wanted to ask the piano?" The young man looked at him. He did not flinch, which I noted. "I was only looking," he said, quiet voice, the accent of this city, not the capital. "Only looking." Vane smiled the smile of a man who has been waited on his entire adult life and has confused that experience for a personality. "And what do you do when you're not looking at other people's instruments?" "Lottery tickets," the young man said. "I sell lottery tickets at the booth on Cal Furrer." There was laughter from the small crowd that had gathered by now, not unkind exactly, but participatory. The kind of laughter that says, "Yes, we see this, we understand which direction this is going." Vane spread his hands. "Well," He tilted his head at the Bersendorfer with the ease of a man offering a rope. "By all means, play something for us, if you'd like to look a little closer." A murmur. Someone near me said under their breath this should be short. The young man looked at the piano for a moment. Then he looked at Vane. Then he sat down. He sat in the way that only people who have spent thousands of hours at a keyboard sit, not settling, not arranging, but arriving. His back straightened without effort, and his hands came to rest in his lap for just a moment, and then he placed them on the keys, and he played the opening bar of the Liszt Mephisto Waltz No. 1. I want to be careful here, because I have spent 44 years in this hall, and I have a civil servant's distrust of exaggeration. The laughter stopped. It did not fade. It stopped the way a light stops when you cut the power, not a dimming but an ending. The Mephisto Waltz is not a kind piece. It is technically one of the most demanding things in the solo piano literature, a work of sustained ferocity that requires not just technique, but the particular psychological stamina to sustain its energy across 15 minutes of almost unbroken velocity and fire. It has broken competition pianists in front of audiences. It has ended careers. It is the piece that the serious listener brings to a recital, half-hopping. They will not have to hear it performed badly. Paz Ruano. I learned his name later. He did not introduce himself that evening, played it as though he had been waiting to play it his entire life, and had simply been waiting for a large enough room. The opening motif, the thing Liszt marks quasi niente, almost nothing, emerged from under his hands with a precision and a control that made the hairs on my arm stand. Not nothing, intimate. A whisper between two people in a room of hundreds. And then the texture opened, the bass line arriving like the first footstep of something enormous, and the hall, 380 seats of it, and whatever was left standing at the edges was perfectly, completely still. I watched Vane. He had remained at the side of the stage, and his expression had done something I would find difficult to name. The performance smile had gone, not replaced by embarrassment exactly, but by something more private, the look of a man revising an estimate he had been very confident in. Paz moved through the waltz without hesitation. The middle section, the accelerating dance, the passage that sounds like argument and acceleration and something coming apart, fell from his hands with a fluency that was not showing off. It was simply fluent, the way breathing is fluent, the way you speak your own language without thinking about the words. He leaned into the left hand through the chromatic runs, and he pulled the right hand back over the melody with a control that made the contrast land in the chest rather than simply in the ear. I have heard the Mephisto Waltz performed by people who practiced it for 20 years. I heard it that Tuesday performed by a lottery clerk from Cal Furrer, and I cannot tell you they were different experiences. I can tell you they were the same one. When he reached the coda, the final page, the place where Liszt presses down on the accelerator and refuses to let off, the hall had acquired the specific quality of silence that is not actually silence, but the sound of 380 people not moving. Breathing, yes. Moving, no. The coda came apart in his hands like something being unveiled rather than concluded, and the final chord arrived in the hall and the ceiling caught it and held it there, warm, slightly longer than physics ought to allow. He did not lift his hands immediately. Neither did anyone speak. Neither did anyone applaud. There was a strange, suspended moment where the hall seemed to be deciding what to do with itself. And then Paz began to play again. Not Liszt, something else, something I did not recognize and have not been able to identify in the years since, because I believe it was his own, a melody that began in the left hand, patient and low, with the quality of something long held in a particular place in the chest. Not sad, precisely. Not tender, precisely. A sound that was shaped like the specific feeling of knowing something your whole life without having been given permission to say it. The right hand found it gradually. Not a theme and accompaniment, more like two voices arriving at the same conclusion by different roads. The piece was perhaps 4 minutes long. It moved through several rooms of feeling without rushing any of them. At one point, the melody climbed to a register that is almost painful in the Börsendorfer's upper range and held there, pianissimo, for 8 bars. And in those 8 bars, there was not a person in the Salon Dorado who was thinking about anything except what they were hearing. It ended quietly. The last note was a single bass note, deep and round, and he let it decay entirely before he lifted his hands. The silence lasted, I counted, because I am a civil servant and I count things 5 full seconds. Then a woman in the 4th row stood up. Then everyone else. I say everyone. I mean what I observed from my position near the left apron stairs. The standing rose from the 4th row outward in the way a good chord rings from the center, through the body of the hall up to the back rows. And then, last and slowly, without theatrics, from the side of the stage where Maestro Aldrich Vane had been standing for the last 20 minutes watching a lottery clerk from Cal Furrer do the thing Vane had spent a lifetime learning to do. Vane did not look away. I will give him that. He looked at the young man at the Börsendorfer and he applauded. Steady, deliberate, without theater. The applause of a man who has just learned something true about the distribution of gifts in the world and is deciding, in real time, what to do with that information. Paz stood and turned. He did not bow in the manner of a performing musician. He simply turned and faced the hall the way a man faces weather, taking it in. He appeared mildly surprised, not overwhelmed, as if the standing ovation were a reasonable response that he had not particularly anticipated and was not particularly troubled by. Someone near me said, "Who is he?" I said, "He sells lottery tickets on Cal Furrer." After the applause settled and the second half of the program resumed and Vane played his scheduled closing pieces with consummate skill and a perceptibly altered quality of attention, I made my way toward the stage door on a whim. I do not generally do this. I am 71 years old and I have long since understood that the good seats, the good wine, and the good acoustics are sufficient. The young man was there, in the corridor, in his pressed-but-not-recently jacket, waiting for no particular reason as far as I could see. Or perhaps he was simply unwilling to leave the building quite yet. I understood that. I have felt that way about the Salon Dorado myself. I said, "Where did you study?" He said, "I didn't. My grandmother had a piano. She let me sit at it when she wasn't home." I said, "The Mephisto Waltz." He said she had the score. I worked through it over about 4 years. I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "And the other piece, the one after?" He looked at me. He said, "I've had that one longer." I shook his hand. He had ink on his fingers still, the particular ink of lottery ticket carbon, blue-black and stubborn. His grip was firm and brief, and he went out through the side door into the Lay Totham Street, and I have not seen him since. I have not looked particularly. I am not certain looking is the point. What I have kept in the 44 years I have been coming to that hall is a catalogue of evenings, the great ones, the adequate ones, the ones that sent you home thinking about other things. That Tuesday sits in its own category, not because of what Paz Ruana was or where he came from or the neatness of the reversal, though the reversal was very neat, because of the 8 bars in the upper register, because of the way the ceiling held the sound. You cannot buy a ticket for an evening like that. You cannot schedule it or predict it or sell it across a counter. You can only be sitting in the right seat when it arrives and be still enough to receive it. I am glad of it. I expect I will be glad of it for whatever years remain.